Welcome to Afrometrics, research-based news podcast, where we highlight new and emerging research across the African world. And today we are joined by a special guest, Dr. Akinyemi Oni-Orisan. Dr. Akinyemi Oni-Orisan is a pharmacist scientist and assistant professor. He earned his BS and PharmD degrees at the University of Michigan, received his PhD in pharmaceutical sciences from the Division of Pharmacotherapy and Experimental Therapeutics at the University of North Carolina. He also completed a postdoctoral fellowship in the Clinical Pharmacology Training Program at UCSF and has formal training in applied pharmacology, clinical lipidology, and pharmacogenomics. His long-term research objective is to improve pharmacologic regimens for the prevention of treatment of cardiovascular disease in genetically diverse populations using electronic health records linked to biorepositories. A very powerful article that he has recently published along with his colleagues. And the name of the article is Embracing Genetic Diversity to Improve Black Health, and it's published in New England Journal of Medicine, which is one of the most prestigious peer-reviewed medical journals in the world. It's an honor to have you on to talk about cutting-edge research, especially through the lens of someone who is deeply concerned about the health of people of African descent. The article was powerful. When I read about this article, it put me in the mind of other times that Black medical professionals have called for a paradigm shift in thinking about health. And it reminded me of the 1999 Surgeon General report by David Satcher. David Satcher, the first Black Surgeon General, and he put out his report that focused on mental illness and the role of culture and biology. And although it was about mental illness, one of the things that he talked about was ethnopharmacology in the paper and biological markers, and genetics, and issues like the pace of drug metabolism in African Americans. And your article, along with your co-authors, reminded me of it. And I should mention your co-authors are Yusuf Mavura, Yambazi Banda, Timothy Thornton, and Ronnie Sebro. And this article to me sounded like you all were building on this conversation about genetics and also engaging it in new and innovative ways. Very impactful. And I just wanted to welcome you and ask you to where are you from and what motivated you to become a pharmacist scientist and a geneticist?
Well, first of all, I wanted to sincerely thank you for inviting me today to talk about the paper. This was exactly the goal of the paper. I mean, basically it was to really enhance crosstalk between disciplines on this important topic, and we said that in the paper. And I've read a little bit about you as well. I mean, would you consider yourself a social scientist based
Yes,
on
I
your
would.
background? And okay, so I mean, I'm probably the furthest thing from a social scientist, but I feel like we're on the same team. So thank you, for hearing me out and listening to, to really understand where we're coming from. So, so basically, in terms of your first question, what motivated me to go into pharmacy and to become a geneticist? In terms of becoming a geneticist, it was completely accidental. No one really told me, "Hey, go be a geneticist," right? Growing up, especially as a Black kid, they tell you doctor or lawyer, right? And so right before I started college, I decided I wanted to be a pharmacist. And so I was basically focused on that, like tunnel vision. And and specifically, I wanted to be a pharmacist in a community pharmacy setting, like Rite Aid or CVS, And in pharmacy school, I learned about research. I learned that pharmacists can do research, which I didn't realize. And pharmacists can do academic research. Pharmacists can work for drug companies. And I did this in between my years, in between my first and second year, I did a summer research project, and I really enjoyed it. And basically, at that point, I wanted research to be a major part of my career. And some of my teachers were steering me towards in the direction of a PhD so I could further my research skills. So basically after pharmacy school, I got a PhD just like you said in my bio. And during my PhD training, that's when I became more and more interested in this concept of pharmacogenetics. And to me, it just made sense. We can optimize someone's therapy, or we can even develop new drugs based on genetic variation. And so, pharmacogenetics was basically a major part of my dissertation. And even at that point, I don't think I would consider myself a geneticist at that point. It really wasn't until my postdoc at UCSF, where I trained under Neil Risch, who is one of the leaders in the field of population genetics. And so that's when I really started to learn. I basically went backwards. I started with pharmacogenetics, which is more of an applied human genetics. And then I went to more basic population genetics. And then so that helped because I developed a better foundation of why we do some of the things we do in pharmacogenetics. So that's kind of my journey to genetic research, to human genetic research.
Okay, and what was your dissertation about?
So my dissertation was about a pathway in a physiological pathway, inflammatory pathway, where a specific inflammatory mediators that were found to be associated with heart disease.
Wow.
So we basically, it was a very translational research project, meaning that there was a preclinical component or animal research, and also at the same time there was a clinical research, human research. And we basically demonstrated that the pathway was important in both mice and in humans. And so the pharmacogenetic part is that there are variants in this pathway. There's all these different enzymes that basically mediate these metabolites, these anti-inflammatory metabolites in this pathway. And we showed that there's variation in the genes that code for these enzymes. And we found that they were associated with cardiovascular outcomes. So it was more of a using pharmacogenetics to help develop a drug target for a pathway that there's no drugs on the market that target this pathway.
Wow. So I have no medical background, and I'm listening. So my question is, what was it that there were enzymes that the enzymes vary by genetics, but does the presence of the enzyme or the lack of presence of the enzyme prevent or cause inflammation, or is that what's happening?
Yeah, it's a great question. So it's a very complex pathway because there's different mediators. There's anti-inflammatory mediators and there's inflammatory mediators, and there's different one substrate can basically shunt into different pathways depending on different environmental stimuli. So while some of the enzymes actually enhance the anti-inflammatory mediator, other enzymes actually reduce or basically metabolize or get rid of this anti-inflammatory mediator. So some of the variants were associated with increased inflammatory mediators, and some of them were associated with reduced. So it was quite common. I'm really going back to my mental Rolodex to kind of remember the pathway. But yeah, there's a lot of different enzymes involved, and each of the enzymes have multiple variants. Some of them are associated with increased activity, and some of them are actually reduced the function of the enzyme.
And increased or reduced is related to some outcomes you mentioned.
Yes.
Cardio, what do you recall?
Yep. So your basic major adverse cardiovascular outcomes, heart attack, stroke. We looked at cardiovascular mortality.
Yeah. So and clearly you've continued that interest has stayed with you, right? Because it seems like because that is kind of like a part of what you all address in the article. And what did inspire this particular article, the new article on embracing genetic diversity to improve Black health?
So really it started as an email chain that was originally about a different topic. So it was the middle of last summer, 2020, and my former mentor, current colleague, Neil Risch, had just stepped down as the director of Institute for Human Genetics at UCSF. So he just stepped down as director, and the email chain was basically my former mentor, Neil Risch, and then his four former trainees that were Black, okay, including myself. And actually, there's one of the trainees is current. He also has a current student. So, and some of us trained with him 15 years ago. And like I said, there's a current student right now. So, and basically, the email chain, we're just reminiscing about old times, working with Neil over the past decade or so, 15 years. And there was a recent New England paper that we circulated in the email chain, and it was called Hidden in Plain Sight. And it was about the use of race in clinical algorithms. And we thought the paper was cluttered with like misinformation on the topic. And we also, we felt that our perspective wasn't really prevalent in the literature. So we collectively decided to produce this paper. And that's kind of how it started, just from an email chain.
Wow. And can you speak on just maybe one or two of the things that were in this article that was problematic in some ways? What kind of misinformation did you all find in there?
Well, so I think the main point of the article is that we should remove race from algorithms that are used to guide how we treat patients. Okay. The issue, and some of the main points. So one of the main things is that they don't actually address the big picture, and their focus, in our opinion, was very misleading. So one of the things is like there's a historical context that they didn't really report. So a lot of these algorithms, which include race as one of many factors, are actually quite recent. So these are in the past 10, 15, 20 years. This is in the grand scale, these are actually pretty recent. And they weren't there before because the prior studies were in all white populations. So a good example is there's an algorithm that we use currently to detect the risk of heart disease. Okay, and it's called the ASCVD risk score. It basically predicts your risk of having a stroke, heart attack, cardiovascular death in the next 10 years. And the algorithm was originally based on the results of what was called the Framingham Heart Study. And so this was a study that was almost entirely white residents of Framingham, Massachusetts. So a very homogeneous population, right? The study was definitely useful because it elucidated a lot of risk factors for heart disease that they used for decades, but it had very poor external validity, meaning it wasn't accurate at predicting risk in other populations, including in Black Americans. So because of that problem, subsequent algorithms addressed this by doing studies which included cohorts of Black Americans. Hence the risk factor. And it's not actually a risk, it's not really a race correction or a race adjustment. It's actually a completely different equation. It's actually more race stratified. Now, is it perfect? No. These race stratified algorithms are not perfect, but if we remove it, the problem is that we go back to the Framingham algorithm, where we basically take results in whites, those of predominantly European descent, and we extrapolate it to everyone else. So the paper doesn't cover the full historical context. Number one, I personally, when that algorithm came out in 2013, I was very happy to see that they actually included Black cohorts in their algorithm. I was pleased. So for someone to say that we should remove it doesn't quite get the full picture. Another issue that I have with the paper is that it promotes this colorblind strategy to healthcare. So there's actually a paragraph in the paper where the authors say, hey, we don't do that. We're not being colorblind. But then every other statement in the paper suggests that they remove race, just almost blindly, just remove race, and that's going to solve all the issues. So in our opinion, it was a very colorblind approach. And then, so the last thing, and probably most importantly, that in my personal opinion, this paper is a clear-cut example of aversive racism, where, honestly, I lost sleep for like 2 or 3 nights after I read the paper because I was so, basically aversive racism is kind of like a defense, you can call it a defense mechanism, right? by those who are not disadvantaged. So in this country, white people, for example, will try to distance themselves away from racism. So, they basically, for example, blame society at large, or racism is something that's over the hill, through the woods, right? It's just this far away thing, and they don't actually look at themselves. So they don't want to, and they also don't want to, they don't want to admit that racism is everywhere. It pervades all society, from academic institutions to healthcare to entertainment, everything. And they also don't want to admit that they benefited from racism, right? So, for example, a department chair, might say, I really want to hire a diverse body of faculty, but there's no good Black candidates in the pipeline. It's not my fault, right? It's not my fault. I'm trying, but I can't do anything about it. And in reality, they've made zero effort to identify good candidates, right? Another example, is that you see something bad happens, right? Like Dante Wright this very week, or George Floyd last year. And then a company or society or like a university issues out a statement, and they basically denounce what happened, right? We denounce what happened. It's anti-Black racism. There's no place for that. But then they'll never describe the very policies that they have instituted to contribute to the problem. They don't point at themselves. So in terms of this paper, the authors are blaming these very, very recent algorithms on disparities that existed and that have existed for centuries. And it kind of gives this false impression that things were good at first, then we introduced these algorithms, and then things became really bad. And that these algorithms are depriving Black people of key resources that are necessary in healthcare. So, if you believe that's the case, it's okay. I think it's perfectly fine to have that hypothesis, but health science is based on evidence. So you have to provide evidence that the algorithms have worsened disparities. Especially since they were done with good intention. They were done because prior algorithms didn't have a lot of, weren't predictive or weren't precise in other populations. So it really wouldn't be difficult to do a study where you just look at people before the algorithm and look at people after, and then see what happens. And the authors provide no evidence in the paper. So to me, it's almost like into the realm of conspiracy theory. You're making a strong statement about something with no evidence. In fact, there's evidence of the exact opposite. So one of the algorithms is an algorithm for kidney function. Using there's many different factors, but race is one of the factors. And there's actually evidence that the algorithm with race actually has improved outcomes, specifically for Blacks. So kidney function is also a great example, because there's actually evidence of a completely different culprit than the algorithm. So, for example, for somebody that has kidney disease or is at risk for kidney disease, right? We have these tests that we can, to determine the health of someone's kidneys. Okay, so we can do kidney function tests. We can look at protein in the urine, proteinuria or albuminuria. And if we see protein in the urine, this is evidence that their kidneys are at risk. Your kidneys are at risk for failure, for eventual failure. Like your nephrons, your kidney cells are dying. So we need to intervene, right? You can do simple interventions. You can reduce sodium intake, right? You can tell someone to have a low salt diet, control blood pressure with medication or with the reduce sodium intake. You can also refer someone to a nephrologist so they can get specialized treatment, right? But importantly, you can't recover your kidney function once you lose it. Once those nephrons die, you can't get them back, right? You have to then resort to dialysis or transplant. So importantly, so when you see that someone has their kidneys are at risk, you have to intervene early, and you have to intervene aggressively, right, to prevent end-stage renal disease. So they've actually shown with evidence that primary care physicians have been less aggressive in preventing kidney failure in Black patients that are at risk. So there's evidence that they've actually primary care physicians have delayed referring a patient to a nephrologist, when they're at risk. Or there's also evidence that nephrologists also provide substandard care, for Black patients once they're finally referred. So, instead of focusing our attention on these evidence-based issues contributing to disparities in kidney disease, we're actually pointing a finger at a completely different scapegoat, at these algorithms. It's easier to blame an inanimate object than an individual. So that's why, so basically that was one of the issues. So, I've never seen a primary care physician stand up and say, hey, you know, I've contributed to these disparities by subconsciously delaying treatment for Black patients at risk for kidney disease. And this is what I'm going to do to change that. I've never seen that, but everyone wants to point a finger at these algorithms. So sorry, long-winded response, but those are some of my issues with that paper.
No, thank you. That was a great response. I think it needed to be that length. It sounds like that aversive racism is providing it sounds like, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like that it's providing a cover that and it sounds like from reading your paper, you kind of talk about this emerging, this kind of ideology of equity and inclusion, or equity or equality, that is abstract and ambiguous in some ways because it's being interpreted differently in different spaces around the country right now, and which is kind of in vogue. And you mentioned in the wake of the killing of George Floyd and racial disparities and the impact of COVID-19. And as you all explained in the article, that there's a naive colorblind ideology in the name that's going around in the name of anti-racism, but is indeed in and of itself racist. It is, and as you named, aversive racism you talked about. And this, to me, it sounds similar to the kind of racism that we've seen in other areas. I mean, for people who may not know much about medical science, people are starting to hear about how facial recognition software has been normed on white populations to the point that it's making mistakes that differ systematically based on race, that mistakenly not recognizing or misidentifying Black faces. And so there's concerns about police using facial recognition software because the research is flawed that the software is based on. And then we've seen in the past where family policies are normed based on white populations, white families, middle-class white families, and applied broadly to Black families. So this idea of research being at the root of some of the systematic racism that we see, I think it's important that we also see the role that it can play in medical science as well. So I really appreciate you all again in this article, making this translatable, making this digestible to people so that they can recognize it. And you all give some very specifics as well. But before we go there, I did want to ask you something. I wanted to backtrack a little bit and we'll go back forward. But something that was really impressive to me in just reading about this article is that you all talk about the constitution of the authorship of the article in general, because you're an author on here and you have several co-authors, but you make mention of the authorship, the fact that you are all Black male geneticists, including a Nigerian American, a Tanzanian American, a Zambian, and Tobagonian. And it was inspiring to see a Pan-African Black male collaboration between authors on this paper. And I hope this is not too personal a question, but I wanted to ask how you all came to know one another in this field and become research partners. You already talked about how you all came to do this particular study, but can you talk a little bit about how this, I think, special collaboration came together on a personal level?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, at first, one of the reasons why we wanted to really put that out there and say, hey, this is who we are, is because we've gone through, as students, postdocs, faculty, and when you're doing research, you tend to read a lot of papers, over time. So I've never read a paper that has that kind of authorship, especially on that topic. I mean, on the topic of race, you're not going to see a lot of Black geneticists as authors. Sometimes you do. Mm-hmm. Sometimes if they are, there's maybe one that's kind of planted somewhere in the middle of the authorship, but it's not completely owned by that demographic. So we wanted to just make that clear exactly who we were. But in terms of how I've known these guys for years. I mean, like I said, we're all former and there's one current trainee of Neil Risch. So we all have the same at one point, different times. I mean, none of us intersected, but at various times we all trained under Neil Risch, and we've connected in various ways. So it's, I mean, almost like a network. National conferences. I actually shared an office with Bazi Banda, who's one of the co-authors, for a few months when he was a research specialist at UCSF. And about 5 years ago, when it was time for me to learn how to do genome-wide association studies, I actually went up to University of Washington and I learned from Tim Thornton, who's another co-author. So he's the one who taught me how to use the software for the genome-wide association studies. So we have a long-standing connection.
Okay, wow. And you mentioned that it shaped your perspective.
Yeah.
How so? Is it because you had this common experience and you also you had the common factor of Neil Risch? Is that a part of it as well?
I don't know if I think it's more of just being geneticists, of being Black geneticists. We have a little bit of a different perspective. First of all, we understand that at a fundamental level, genetic variation has biological consequences. I think that's really important that some people may overlook, right? We've seen it firsthand in our own studies. We've seen, we have people with genetic variant and there's a different outcome than those who don't. So we've seen it in our studies, Secondly, we understand all of the advances, all the great advances that we've made in medicine due to genetic studies.
Oh, yes.
And I don't think a non-geneticist, may not fully understand how far we've come and all the promise, So that's the perspective. In terms of race, race is obviously a very complex thing, right? Social construct, but it captures a lot. So it captures racism. It captures cultural differences, right? Unrelated to racism. It captures, and it does capture genetic variation, So as geneticists, we basically understand that the genetic aspect, I think, better than others, right? Does it perfectly capture genetic variation? No, of course not. But if you take a study, right, and you don't have any Black participants in the study, so you only have self-identified white participants in the study, you're depriving the study from a substantial amount of human genetic variation that no other population on this earth can account for. No matter how large the population is, you're not going to get the genetic variation that's going to really capture all the variation that's on this planet. So that's what we mean when we say there's a genetic component to race in the paper. It's really a discussion of inclusion and scientific advancement that ultimately benefits not only those who aren't included currently, but also ultimately everyone.
Look, and this is a question I want to ask you as you talk, it makes me think about this. For every university, there's a procedure you have to go to if you want to do research on human subject, and you have to follow ethical guidelines, et cetera. And I just want to ask you, this could just be a rhetorical question, but why is there nothing that flags a study that's answering a generalized question that's not ethnic specific, not race specific, but it is normed on a predominantly white population? Why is there nothing that flags the question, that flags that? Why does that not raise it? How does it continue? Those kind of studies continue to be approved? Question I'm throwing out there. I don't know if there's an answer to it.
That's a good question. Actually, there has been efforts to, because that is unethical to not include all population. There actually has been. The NIH has put out guidance, and you're supposed to report the race, self-reported race, ethnicity of your population. So the NIH has, I think it has 4 or 5 categories that does that. So they have actually said that these studies need to be inclusive. You need to include minority populations. But it's one thing to say it, it's nothing to do it. So even though I think this was 20 years ago when they said that, and there hasn't been a lot of improvement since then. And my colleague Esteban Bouchard, I think, put out a paper where they looked at that. They looked at how things have changed since the NIH stated that, and so there has been that. The question is that the answer is that there has been, but that it hasn't really been implemented fully.
I'm glad to hear that it has been, and I hope that it is implemented more in the future. There's another thing that you mentioned. We're talking about race just now, and you make a distinction in your paper. You and your co-authors make an important distinction, and that is that you look at the relationship between genetic ancestry and outcomes more so than it's more reliable than racial self-identification. Can you talk about that? You're using genetic ancestry as the factor that's more reliable than racial self-identification.
Yeah. So you're asking me if it.
Why is that? Why is that
why is
so?
that?
That's important because that's an important distinction there because you all are looking at
Yeah.
that. That's what the science is, and I just want to make a distinction for the
Yeah.
listeners that it's not like, oh, a person self-identifies as a Black. You seem to be looking at ancestry. If that's correct, let me know.
Yeah. So in terms of characterizing total human genetic diversity, ancestry is more precise than race. Absolutely.
Right. Yeah.
And ancestry is you can't identify as an ancestry, right? It's just it's your genome. So we have, when you take individuals, you basically can use these statistical tools like principal components analysis where you look at how related individuals are, and you based on their genetics, and so basically what happens is that individuals tend to cluster based on these principal components, and so without any other information other than your DNA, we can actually characterize an individual's genetic ancestry, and it absolutely is more precise in terms of genetic diversity than race.
Yeah, and you talk about the fact that Africa has more genetic diversity, relatively speaking, and why is that important? Is that important because of the generalizability of research in that area?
So I mean, it's exactly. So in terms of, you can't generalize results in one population to another, to African population, because there's the most genetic diversity. So it's really about inclusion. It's not just a moral obligation to include individuals. It's also scientific rationale, right? Just like in studies, we need to account for as many social determinants. When you're looking at, what are the sources of this racism? Is it income? Is it access to water? So you account for as many social determinants as possible in some of these studies. Just like you need to account for as many as possible, you also need to account for as much genetic variation as possible in these studies. So, and we can't possibly do that without African ancestry in our studies. Wow. So absolutely.
I think that's important. I think it does speak to some concern that people have expressed. So for example, you're talking about the importance of looking at genetic diversity. How do you respond to like some concern that, like this research could be used to stereotype, genetic research could potentially be used to racially profile Black people or stereotype based on said genetics?
Yeah, that's a valid argument. And that's a very important concern because it's been done in the past, right? People have used genetics inappropriately and unscientifically to create hierarchies where they have, these people, white people or people of European descent are at the top and people of African descent are at the bottom. And there's all these traits that can, and it's completely inappropriate. And they've also used genetics as stereotype. Hey, somebody, because they're Black, they have some trait. And so we're going to treat them like this, So that's why we need to be proactive in how we approach genetic studies in terms of how we conduct the research, how we train our students and our trainees, and how we ultimately implement the findings from genetic research into clinical practice. We have to do it in an anti-racist manner to avoid some of these consequences, these ethical concerns, social and ethical concerns. Absolutely. Yeah,
because I think people have, and some people have in the back of their mind, okay, what happened, the experiences of a Black woman like Henrietta Lacks, and how her cells were used, shared without her knowledge and profited on, et cetera, in the back of their minds. And it sounds like that you're saying, okay, this is the kind of history that should make us go forward responsibly, but not foreclose on the research because these things have happened in the past, but instead go forward responsibly.
Absolutely.
Right?
I mean, we all need to, everyone who does research should know about the Henrietta Lacks story. Everyone who does research should know about the Tuskegee experiments, right? Because of these atrocities, But the one thing that we don't want to do, we don't want people to use this as an excuse to run away from, because like I said in the beginning, there's all these advances, right? There's all these advances that that we can derive from genetic research. So we don't want to turn away from that. I think a good example was COVID-19. So the COVID-19 vaccine, right? A lot of Black people had concerns about the vaccine because of Tuskegee and because of some of the past issues with trusting the medical community, right? And so those issues are valid, but if we don't get the vaccine, we're actually at increased risk to get COVID. So we kind of, because of the past past atrocities does not mean we should not benefit from advances in science and health. And that's ultimately, going to help to reduce disparities. If we just kind of push ourselves away from, all these advances, that's going to contribute to disparities.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a strong point. I think this is one thing though that I've noticed, like in the media, is that, and we have mentioned it too, the past Henrietta Lacks, Tuskegee, et cetera, things in the past, and also, of course, there's kind of the mistrust in the medical community by some because of very recent, very contemporary personal experiences as well, and that it's not just historical, but kind of a continuity of experience, even if not of the same type as Tuskegee, but kind of mistreatment as well, which you spoke to earlier in this conversation, I think. But as you mentioned, you know that this is not a reason to not go forth. And I do want to ask you to talk about some of those advances. And you give one that's really specific. I thought was a powerful example. You talked about genetic differences in the effectiveness of warfarin dosing levels for heart conditions or blood clots. Can you explain that, how genetic differences and race or ancestry play a role in the differences in warfarin dosing levels for heart conditions, blood clots?
Yeah, sure. So basically, there was a study called the COAG trial, and fortunately, they did some post hoc analyses, and they looked at differences across race, which allowed us to determine if there was a disparity. Because if they hadn't done that, we would never know that there was this disparity. And the purpose of the study was to determine if pharmacogenetics or genetic variants could improve the dose prediction of warfarin on top of clinical factors. So in the Black subjects, what they ended up finding was that the genetic variants actually, not only did they cause no effect, but they actually were worse. So people, so basically those who were randomized to receive clinically based strategy for warfarin dosing did better than those who actually had the clinical plus pharmacogenetics, which is, weird, paradoxical. So the question is, why did that happen? It's not fully understood, but if you look at the algorithm that was used, you'll know that the variants are some of the variants that were used are not actually as common in those with African ancestry as those without African ancestry. And some of the variants that have been found in African populations to impact warfarin were not included in the algorithm. And the algorithm has been used in prior studies. This was a randomized controlled trial. But before the trial, there was actually other studies which looked at how the algorithm worked. And they showed that the algorithm was actually more accurate in those of European descent than those of Africans. So before they even put this algorithm to test in a randomized control, they already knew it was better in European populations. So what do you expect? And like I said, there wasn't a conclusive list of variants that would have covered those with African ancestry. But in addition, we know that the variants have different effect sizes, right? And we actually add that into the algorithm. So basically, maybe this variant in CYP2C9 has an effect size of X, and so you put that in the algorithm, right? But they found that the effect size of each variant differs by ancestry. So we can't use the same effect size for every ancestry. And why does effect size differ? It's not known, but there might be some gene environmental interactions. So ultimately, I guess the key point is that we need an algorithm that is favorable in those who identify as Black, those with African ancestry.
Wow. And here's my question, just a follow-up to that. Okay, once you know that there are these differences in the effectiveness of the doses, how do you act upon that? Like, what do you then do with that when it comes to like being in, like actually treating a patient? You have this knowledge of how there's these differences, and a person walks into the doctor's office. How does that translate from the knowledge of it to how you implement it?
Yeah, so there's a lot of unknowns in science, in health, and how we treat individuals. There's just a lot of unknowns, right? Mm-hmm. So right now, because of that, we actually don't know what the best algorithm is for those with African ancestry. So, right, if someone comes into my office and they're Black, I'm not going to use a pharmacogenetic, based algorithm. I'm going to use the standard clinical algorithm, or the standard algorithm that we use, because we don't have enough evidence. We need to generate more research so that we can better treat the patients. There's not enough studies in those populations, unfortunately.
Yeah. Okay.
So the advances of genetics that promises to be more precise in terms of how we treat patients, we haven't realized that in the African population. We haven't been able to take advantage of that technology, unfortunately.
Okay. Another thing that came to mind for me was when it comes to conditions like asthma, diabetes, obesity, do we know anything at this point about if there are any differences by ancestry in those conditions, genetic ancestry?
Yeah. So, what you're describing are complex traits, right? These, like diabetes, is multifactorial. There's obviously a lot of lifestyle choices that someone can make to develop that could really help to increase their risk of type 2 diabetes. But there's also some genetic factors. There are some genetic factors that have been discovered that also play a role. So a lot of these diseases, these complex diseases, are multifactorial.
You all mentioned how important it is, and you kind of talked about this just when we were exchanging with one another, the importance of collaboration between geneticists and social scientists. And why do you all feel that that's so important?
I think that it's just important to have different perspectives. The more perspectives that we have, the more progress we can make with a topic, especially a topic that has so many different issues at hand. When we talk about race and medicine, there's so many different things to consider. There's the social aspect, there's the health aspect, there's the, genetics has a role here. So we need to have all these different experts, these specialists that kind of come together and find a common ground.
Yeah, I think that relates to what you just said, because when it comes to those things like diabetes, obesity, etc., there's a lot of factors that explain variation in those diseases, and it makes sense to include these different perspectives to give a more full explanation. But I think that this article really has really pushed the ball and got the ball rolling in a powerful way. And it makes me think of this Reconstruction, the end of Reconstruction, and people debate on the social science side, or historians, I guess, debate about what were the lessons of Reconstruction for the Black community in this like post Civil War area, all of these Black advancements in terms of politics and positions of power. And of course, the end of Reconstruction, where the systematic removal of Black people from positions, but the issue of Black institutional power. And the reason I mention it is because of how this article in itself emerged. It emerged from Black geneticists. It emerged from you all drawing on one another's collective thinking. And so I wonder if an article like this would have been written without you all, I mean, what role do you think race-specific initiatives, organizations, institutions like HBCUs or Black medical professional organizations will have to play in order for significant progress in an area like this to take place? And again, just looking at how this emerged, it emerged from Black geneticists and their collective efforts. So what do you think about that? What role do Black organizations, institutions, what role must they play,
Right.
or must they, in your perspective? Yes.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, you raised a good point when you talked about the end of Reconstruction, right?
Yeah.
Black people were systematically removed from positions of power in politics, and ultimately Black people suffered, correct?
Yes.
That kind of began the Jim Crow era, and Black people were basically disenfranchised and disadvantaged for decades and decades.
But left behind key legislation that became the foundation for civil rights movement too. So I don't want to paint it all too bad.
Okay, exactly, true. But I think that when Black people don't have a voice, it ultimately is to the detriment of Black people, right? So I think I think that we just need a voice. We need more of a voice. HBCUs, we need a voice. We need to have, I think we talked about this at the end of our paper, we need to have more Black scientists and Black clinicians, and we need that perspective in different fields. And not just social science or genetics. I mean, we need Black marine biologists, we need Black geologists, we need Black astronauts. We're lacking in some of these fields, lacking in some of the STEM fields. And the impetus isn't only on HBCUs and Black organizations. I mean, we all, other organizations also have an important role in this. I mentioned in the beginning about the aversive racism. Oh, there's no one in the pipeline. I can't find anyone to diversify my faculty with. You need to intentionally recruit. You need to go to these HBCUs and recruit talent. You need to go to professional societies and find some of the most promising scientists to add to your department. And if we have role models, then we can more likely recruit even more individuals of Black people into the field. There's studies showing that role models are key to diversifying fields. So the best way to increase diversity is to have diversity, so that we can get more diversity to keep going. It's like the gift that keeps giving. So yeah, there's a role for Black organizations like HBCUs, like you mentioned. There's a role for non-Black organizations, to diversify some of these fields. I will say right now that there's probably maybe 10 Black geneticists in this country.
Wow.
There's not a lot. I mean, half of the Black geneticists in this country were on the paper. The American Society of Human Genetics has been, going for decades and decades. We just had our first Black president last year. Charles Rotimi was the first Black president of American Society of Human Genetics. And before that, there was no one on the board of directors or presidents, So that's not good to not have diversity in these fields.
Well, I want to go back to something you just said, that about half, I guess you're approximating that perhaps half of the Black geneticists in the country were on this paper. And I think that should say something to everybody who's listening to this, to pick up a copy of the paper, or to search it, to find it. The title, of course, I already mentioned, Embracing Genetic Diversity to Improve Black Health. Again, a paradigm shifting piece. And I think that it's a short one, and it's very powerful. So I think that this conversation about genetics is extremely important. I'm glad that you came. And I want to ask you about some other things, though, that I think maybe some people have heard, and particularly I want to ask, what are your thoughts on CRISPR-Cas9? This is not your, this is not something that you wrote about at all. But I'm just taking the opportunity. If I have a Black geneticist, and the opportunity to ask you questions like this about these topics, I want to ask you about CRISPR-Cas9, the gene editing technology, which some people promote as something that can be used to edit out genes associated with harmful diseases. And I want to ask you specifically about this, because I think that in this conversation about CRISPR-Cas9, surprisingly, Black people have been named in these conversations a lot. And I find it a real interesting change of pace, because in promoting it, some are saying, for example, that it could potentially be used to edit out genetic markers associated with sickle cell. So, you find them having this interesting situation where often you don't hear any mention of Black people, but you're hearing like this mention of them when it comes to CRISPR-Cas9. At the same time, there are scientists coming out warning about the dangerous effects of the editing that it can have. But because I have the opportunity to ask an expert, I want to ask your opinion on it.
Yeah, no, that's interesting that you said that Black people are being named. I had no idea. I mean, I will start by saying that I'm not an expert in CRISPR-Cas9. But I do see the benefits of that technology, for at least for research purposes. In terms of editing out potential deleterious mutations, or I think that's a question for kind of what we said about having a diverse set of experts looking at issues, because there are ethical issues and the social issues. So I think that we need to, a geneticist alone can't make a decision, right? We need to get the bioethicists involved in terms of what's appropriate and what's not appropriate. We need a social scientist. We need you at the table as well, weighing in on your opinion. So yeah, I don't think I'm ready to make a specific statement on whether or not this technology should be used to edit, genes and humans. But I will say that this is a absolutely novel and ingenious idea, and a technology that is going to be a game changer. It's going to be, it has been a game changer, and it will continue to be.
Yeah, and let me apologize. I put you on the spot on something that you totally did not, your article is totally not about, but just wanted to take the opportunity to ask you. You also mentioned in your work that African countries have a relatively low mortality rates, and I think that's in relation to COVID-19. Can you talk a little bit about why that is, and what high-income countries could potentially learn?
Yeah, so I think this is mainly due to prior experience in controlling epidemics in Africa, such as Ebola, So there were, travel restrictions, curfews, all the things, school closures and whatnot. And importantly, they were implemented very early in some of the African communities. So they didn't wait till the cases got high before they started to implement it. They knew, oh, we have another pandemic, we can use some of the same. The infrastructure was already in place. And so that's basically what we meant by that, hey, some of these developing countries could learn a thing or two about how to control pandemics.
Okay. And something you mentioned earlier, I think we may have, that you mentioned in passing, I want to go back to, is you talked about already in terms of heart disease, but I wanted to ask you if you could say a little more about what we've already learned. I mean, you gave the example, but I wanted to see if you could talk a little bit about some of what we have already learned as a consequence of the genetic research.
Yeah. So one example is with a gene called ApoL1. So we've actually discovered a variant that's more common in African ancestry of a variant in ApoL1. And so this variant is thought to have protection against sleeping sickness, which is a parasitic infection, that is potentially fatal. But at the same time, it also, because of that variant also confers risk to, again, end-stage renal disease. And so if we hadn't done the research in African populations, we would never have discovered the variant. And actually, it's one of the more common causes of end-stage renal disease outside of diabetes. Diabetes is probably one of the most common causes outside of diabetes. Probably it's up there in terms of causing end-stage renal disease. So it's important. That's important, absolutely important in terms of disparities, because if we didn't know about this variant, now that we know, we can aggressively treat patients that have this variant. We can treat them early. We can treat them aggressively. We can prevent development into end-stage renal disease. We'll know what to do. And we can also ultimately find therapies that could help this population. So to make a blanket statement and say, hey, all disparities are due to racism, it may not, be the most beneficial thing to do. I mean, obviously, a large part of the reason why CKD is more prevalent in Black Americans is because of, like I said, we talked about the delayed referral to nephrologists, less likely to get evidence-based therapies like ACE inhibitors and ARBs, which prevent the progression to end-stage renal disease. So there's a lot of social factors that are involved. People can't, may not be able to afford their medication or may not have adequate insurance. But there's also genetic factors that it's important to learn, But one thing I did want to mention is that I think a really important concept is that it's not always like variants cause worse outcomes in Black people. There's variants that do the exact opposite, protective variants.
Oh, yes. Talk about that, please.
So there's a recent study that was done by some of my colleagues here at UCSF and in collaboration with Kaiser Division of Research. And what they did was they actually found that this is it's called squamous cell carcinoma. And it's a type of cancer that's 35 times more prevalent in those with European descent compared to those with African ancestry. So Black people are essentially protected from this cancer, 35-fold difference. So, and they ultimately found that European ancestry confers increased risk. So they actually looked at those who are identified as Latino, Latinx. The Latinx community has varying levels of European ancestry in the community. And they actually found that within Hispanic or Latino participants in the study, the more European ancestry, the more likely they were at risk for this carcinoma. So it goes both ways, Another example, there was a recent study, again done by some of my colleagues, about atopic dermatitis. It's a skin disorder, and they found it was a twofold increased risk in those who identified as Black. So they wanted to determine what was the source of this disparity. They looked at genetic factors. They didn't find any genetic factors that predicted. They looked at ancestry. They didn't find ancestry wasn't a cause. They looked at variants that were associated with skin pigmentation. There was no association there. They ruled out all these genetic factors. They found some evidence that suggested that income, a social determinant, income was actually associated with increased risk. The lower the income, the more you're at risk for atopic dermatitis. So this is an example where they had asked the empirical question. There's a disparity, twofold increased risk in self-identified Black individuals. What is the source? We don't know. This is an empirical question. We need to define it. They ruled out genetic variation. Now it's social. So social cause. So now we know how we can address this, right? So for every single disparity, we need to know what the source is. We don't know. People have this idea that geneticists are always trying to find genetic causes of everything. That's not the case. We're trying to just rule out genetic causes. So now, hey, you come in and you can determine what are the social determinants that that are associated with decreased risk of this disease. So one final example that it has to do with benefiting everyone, because I talked about disparity. So there's a gene called PCSK9, and this is a gene that's associated with cholesterol metabolism in our body. Obviously, we know that high cholesterol levels have been associated with increased risk of heart disease. So they found that there is a group of patients that have loss of function variants in the gene that codes for PCSK9. And what they ultimately found was that these patients have lower lifetime cholesterol levels, and also have in turn have a much 80% reduced risk of heart disease over their lifetime. Okay, and so this was a genetic substudy of it's called the Dallas Heart Study. And what they looked at these loss of function variants, but importantly, they stratified by race. And what they found was that the loss of function variant was more common in these African ancestry populations. They used the results of the study. It was key in the development of a novel therapy called PCSK9 inhibitors, where instead of genetic variant, we're actually going to inhibit with PCSK9 with the drug. And so these drugs there's two PCSK9 inhibitors that became approved by the FDA in 2015. They were found to reduce cholesterol levels to very low levels, 20 milligrams per deciliter, 30 milligrams per deciliter. Importantly, on top of patients that were at maximally tolerated statin dose. So this was the first cholesterol lowering therapy after statins that actually causes a significant reduction in heart disease. And so we have this new therapy that's really effective in patients at risk of who are basically at risk of heart disease. But importantly, if we hadn't included self-identified Blacks in the population that having higher prevalence of these PCSK9 inhibitors, we would never have been able to. This substantially helped with the development of this therapy, and ultimately it's benefiting everyone.
Yeah. Wow. Thank you. I appreciate you answering that, and also for pointing out that there are aspects of the genetic variants that are advantages correct me if I don't know if it's appropriate to use that word, but
protective.
Protective that have been discovered. While you were talking, another thing came to mind of something I remember. I cannot remember what year I heard of it, but there was a situation where there was a drug that was being marketed specifically to Black people, and it became really controversial. And I don't think it was based on genetic. I'm not sure if it was based on genetic research at all, but it was called Bidil, I think. Bidil, yeah. But was that okay? But yeah, do you recall that? What are your thoughts about it? Because this is not, and by the way, I'm not saying this is not what you say, but it definitely, what I hear you saying, just as a student taking notes, you correct me if I'm wrong, but a lot of what you're saying is that there needs to be more research. And one of the key things I hear you saying is that there needs to be more research so we can understand better how to implement and explain that genetics is not explaining everything, but we need to know how much of it does explain, etc. Again, just taking notes. But what do you think of that kind of approach where there's kind of like there's a conversation about race medicine? Because in that case, they found something I think that worked. I think I remember reading that it worked better for Black patients, and there was a push to try to market it to Black people, and there was a little controversy over that. But what are your thoughts on it?
Yeah, so Bidil, definitely a controversial topic, so we actually mentioned it in the paper.
Did I miss that? I missed Bidil.
Well, the
I think I missed Bidil
is because Bidil is just a brand name for the drug, which is a combination of two drugs, hydralazine and isosotyl dinitrate. So
hydralazine. I see that. Mm-hmm.
So we do talk about it. And I think that the Bible story, I think it's an amazing saga because it really, first of all, the saga is not over. And it also addresses the importance of research in diverse populations.
Okay.
So yeah, like you said, there was this drug. The study came. The trial was. I think that the trial was reported. The results of the trial was reported in 2004. And after that, this drug company began marketing the drug Vital to Black Americans. And the company ultimately tanked. Right, the company was not able to basically went out of business.
Okay.
So a lot of critics say that, hey, the company had a commercial failure, which basically is evidence that casts doubts on the idea of the study. Right. First of all, the commercial success or failure of a drug has nothing to do of the company. It doesn't do with how the drug works in the body.
Right. That doesn't
There's
make
marketing.
sense.
There's all these things. So the company failed. Okay, that has nothing to do with how the drug works. The company failed because the drug was actually generic. It was basically a combination of two drugs. Both of the drugs were dirt cheap because these drugs have been around for decades. They basically combined and they were used together. They basically combined them and put them and marketed it as a new drug. So instead of, you can either buy the drug or you can buy the brand combination drug, incredibly expensive, or you can buy the two generic drugs separately for very cheap. So that's one of the reasons why the drug went out of business. The company went out of business. But importantly, this clinical trial showed I believe it was 45% reduction in mortality in heart failure patients. There's no other heart failure clinical trial that has been that effective in any population.
Wow.
So it was an effective trial. And again, these were the participants were self-identified Black patients. Okay. So and it was based, and the reason why the trial was based on prior studies that suggested there were hypothesis generating studies, meaning that they weren't powered to detect differences between race. They were done post hoc, so they actually didn't they were done post hoc, so that wasn't what the study was trying to do. But there was VHEFT1, there was a study called VHEFT1, where there was a suggestion where the drug didn't work overall. So the drug didn't work in the broad population, but when they stratified by race, they actually saw these differences. Like it actually worked in those self-identified Blacks and it didn't work in self-identified whites. So based on that prior knowledge, they were like, well, you can't use that to make a clinical decision because, like I said, it wasn't powered. So you have to do a randomized controlled trial. So that's what they did. And the randomized controlled trial validated what they found because it was a very strong effect in Black individuals. But importantly, there's the story is continuing because basically that trial, they were very forward thinking. They gathered samples. They actually gathered clinical samples in participants who enrolled in that trial, so they could look at their genetic background and they could do post hoc genetic sub-studies where they look at genetic variation and how that affects response. And they've actually found variants that predict efficacy for this therapy. And these variants are actually more prevalent in Blacks. So there's actually some evidence that some of the disparities that we saw in terms of drug response to the combination therapy was due to genetic variation that's more common in Blacks. So now the thought is that, hey, we can actually do further studies to determine that if we can find these variants in everyone, we can more precisely select who should benefit from this therapy. So there's ongoing studies as we speak that are looking at genetic variation, agnostic of race, and seeing if that can be used to guide therapy of this combination medication. So, race-based medicine wasn't the finish line. It was a tool. Race was just a tool that was used to include genetic diversity so that we can ultimately get to this stage where we use nothing but genetic variation. That was the finish line. We just haven't gotten there yet. But importantly, if we didn't include Black individuals in the studies, the drug would have never have been shown to be effective. We would have just the drug doesn't work, get rid of it and move on. We would be depriving individuals of this therapy that reduces mortality by 45%. Very powerful drug.
Wow. So, I'm just reflecting on what you said, because is this a case where this colorblind ideology, which motivated some of the dissent around Vital, and it kind of, I guess, a naive interpretation of equality or equity and inclusion has taken off of the table or has limited the use of an effective tool? Is this a case where that ideology
exactly.
has suppressed something that benefits Black people? Do you think? Yeah.
Well, so even though like I said, even though the company tanked, the drug is still available in its generic forms.
Okay.
It's still recommended by the FDA, it's still approved by the FDA for heart failure, and it's still recommended in the Heart Failure Societies of America guidelines. So we're still using, and I've seen it on service when I'm on the heart failure service. It's used. We still use the generic. So we're still actually giving that therapy to people, mostly Black, who have heart failure and who aren't are still having symptoms despite receiving beta blockers and ACE inhibitors. So we're actually still giving that therapy to people. That's what people don't understand.
Good. Okay.
I think a lot of and also another critique is that, hey, this is actually a consequence of hypertension differences in Blacks that are due to racism or other factors. But if you look at this is kind of complex, but if you look at the placebo arms for both the Black individuals and the white individuals, they're actually superimposable. So if baseline hypertension was a factor, then you would see differences in the placebo. Remember, this is the treatment arm that didn't receive therapy. You would see differences between those two arms, but the placebo groups are actually superimposable, which suggests this is a story about drug response rather than some kind of baseline risk of heart failure.
Are you saying that those who received the placebo and those who received the actual drug had the same outcome?
No, I'm saying that if you look at the placebo group this is for the very first, the VHAF, which is the very first study. It was an 80 study where they had whites and Blacks, and that's when they first had this hypothesis that, hey, it actually might work better in self-identified Blacks. You look at the placebo group. So these are the groups that didn't have any therapy. Look at the placebo group for both of the Black versus the white treatment group. You'll see that they are superimposable. The placebo groups for Blacks are superimposable to the placebo groups for whites.
And superimposable meaning that they had the same effect?
Yeah, the same rates of mortality.
Rates of mortality. Okay.
Yeah, and those who didn't receive the drug.
Okay.
Right. So yeah, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does make sense. It makes me but what happened to this company is standing out to me here because it makes me think of something Dr. Kendi, Ibram Kendi talks about. He calls egalitarian exclusion, which is kind of the suppression of race-specific initiatives of all types under the guise that they're not egalitarian, So, and it kind of reminds me of the naive colorblindness hypothesis that you all have in the paper. But
so what is the application of that? When has that manifested itself outside of health?
Oh, wow. That's an interesting question. I think that, if I talk about what Dr. Kendi is talking about on college campuses, so a lot of research, and and that you all talk about in your paper in the wake of movements that are going on. And there has been a big push for egalitarianism, equity, inclusion, et cetera, equality. And as we mentioned several times throughout this conversation, that there's various interpretations of it. And some of those interpretations kind of circle back to a very assimilationist viewpoint, where some people's interpretations are far more respective of race-specific initiatives. On college campus, for example, you can find Pan-African Studies departments, Africana Studies departments. You can find Black student housing, living learning communities, or Black students, or maybe Black STEM students, for example, may form an organization in housing where they're on campus. You can find Black student resource centers, et cetera. Well, what this egalitarian exclusion says is that the very logic of equity and inclusion can be interpreted, especially in times of like financial belt tightening or political shifts, to actually eliminate race-specific initiatives under the very ideology of equity and inclusion, because they're not inclusive enough. In which case, a university might say, "Oh, well, why don't you all just have a Black student cultural center? Just call it a cultural. Just call it ethnic studies department, and not a Black studies department, or Latino studies, et cetera, to kind of collapse race-specific things under the guise of egalitarianism. But that's what that refers to. And it kind of made me think of the case of Bidle. But the promising thing that you said there is that it actually is continued the use, and people are getting access to that. Yeah, I think that another something that I wanted to mention is that stood out to me, something I put a mark next to when I was taking notes on what you were saying, is that, explaining, hey, there are things in the past, there are things that happen now in the past, etc. We cannot allow them to allow us to foreclose on the promise of this research right now. We have to move forward, do more research, and find out what the best practices are. But you mentioned that it needs to be done responsibly. How can that be done? I mean, you mentioned earlier how the NIH has existing policy, and somehow, people continue to get this work through without a problem. And what suggestions have you had time to think about that? Like what things might be put in place to make sure that in this area of research and eventually implementation, that things are done according to the ethical standards that you were talking about, especially in institutions where they're not Black institutions,
Especially in Black institutions you're talking about?
No, institutions where unfortunately persons like you are not controlling. I think it would be nice if maybe you will run an institution. That would be great.
I think you just answered the question. I mean, basically, we need to have more diversity among the researchers that conduct these studies. I think that'll help. I think that just like we need more diversity in terms of, race and ethnicity among the body of scientists that do this type of research, we also need a diversity in terms of disciplines, that are involved. I mean, we need somebody who's studied, bioethic concepts for years and years and years alone. I haven't done that. So I don't have the expertise to, fully understand what needs to be in place in order to prevent some of these atrocities. But I have ears and I can listen and I can learn and I can understand, and we can have a two-way discussion, So I would say the two most important things is having a racially diverse workforce and a multidisciplinary workforce. And I would say that we're in a way we're starting to do that, a little bit. Myself at my university, we're developing these anti-racist or anti-oppressive curriculums and anti-oppressive toolkits that we can use to train our educators into how to communicate with students about race. So we're doing all these different initiatives, and we're now starting to include a lot of people. So I've been invited to give my voice and my perspective on the creation of some of these, and I'm chiming in, and other geneticists are also being asked to come to the table. And there's social science. We have genetic counselors who are involved. We have physicians. We need patients. We need to add patients. We have students that are involved in some of these roundtable discussions. And we're kind of developing this anti-racist, anti-oppressive material that we're going to distribute to everyone on campus. And so I really appreciated some of these multidisciplinary discussions, because the more you talk, the more you realize that we actually have a lot of the same objectives. Actually, we do have the same objectives. We just have different perspectives. And so it's been really humbling for me to be a part of this process. And I think we just need more of this.
More voices at the table, more in multidisciplinary expertise, huh?
Exactly.
Yeah. One thing I noticed about your article that has been a departure from a lot of what I've seen in media, even among Black professionals in medicine lately, is that you did not, well, actually, I shouldn't say that, because Black medical professionals have come out and taken a very healthy approach, I think. But what I noticed about in your paper, you all's paper is that you guys point to a lack of racial diversity in the scientific community as the source of the problem, or source of a lot of the challenge, the dilemma. And you didn't really, there was no statement in the article where you said this kind of Black people, Black consumers, patients, indigenous citizens need to get over it in terms of their concerns, their skepticism, etc. There is kind of a get over it approach, I think, that's present. And I want to backtrack on something I said. I don't think it's coming from the Black medical community, because I think they actually came together and did some really good outreach, but where they were non-judgmental in that way. But you all didn't. Instead, you talked about the importance of diversity, racial diversity in the medical community, scientific community, I think, because for you, that's what you believe will spark change ultimately. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we have, like I mentioned, we have such few Black geneticists. You know, I'm a pharmacist. The amount of Black pharmacists that go into members of faculty in schools of pharmacy is atrocious, you know, so we have a long way to go. In terms of, so when you say get over it, you mean there's
Okay.
some critics that are, yeah, go ahead with that. Some people that are saying, hey, we need to get over Tuskegee and we need to get over slavery and stuff, or what do you mean by that?
Yes. So I think
Okay.
I've heard two kind of lines of logic. One, more the liberal conversation, acknowledging the past, but saying that people simply are misinformed, but their skepticism is understandable. The other, more kind of pejorativist outlook that I've seen, I think, is that there are people who are just ignorant of the science, and they're spreading this ignorance through their doubt, and that this racism is not a thing, this is not an issue anymore. They need to get over it. That kind of approach. As I kind of heard both, but you all's paper, I thought, was a sharp departure from that, because you all kind of address it. What it seems to me that there just needs to be more diversity in the scientific community, and that from that, it sounds like trust will be built going forward.
Yeah, I'm not a fan of, I think there are structural systems and deliberate systems in place that have prevented us from diversifying the workforce. So, you know, I'm not a fan. I don't know how you feel, but I'm not a fan of getting over it, because there's still issues. We still have issues. So, yep. Okay, I'm supposed to get over this, but then, you know, Dante Wright was murdered this week, you know? Yep. So when am I supposed to get over that? We started the paper by talking about what some of the things that we've gone through, you know, in academia, the feelings of imposter syndrome and, you know, some of the isolation that we felt as students and trainees and on faculty, and how that has shaped us, you know? So I'm not going to sit here and say that, hey, I made it, so everyone should make it and get over it. And, you know, I think that it's clear to me that there are still issues. There are still a lot of issues that we need to resolve. And that's all you know, that's a medicine. And I'm getting out of my my area of expertise. Because I don't study that, right? I don't study, you know, some of the things that you study. But just based on my own experience, you know, there are structural racism still alive, and it's holding us back.
Absolutely. So much of this is it's very technical. But the way you all, have to say, the way you all wrote it was very digestible, actually, and put it in very, very understandable language. But I hope that the questions made sense. And if there's anything else you wanted to put on the table, anything else you wanted to add before we wrap up?
You know, I just wanted to say that my field is important. That's another message that we wanted to say. I mean, there's a lot of talk about how, you know, genetics only has a very small impact on health, and it has the reason why we went into this field is because we actually thought that we would help with disparities, you know, and I gave examples of that. I gave the ApoL1 with kidney function, and I gave pharmacogenetic examples, you know, so we think that we're helping with disparities. That's why we got into this field. So I hope that I was able to convince you, Siri, today, at least you. If I can convince you, then that our work is important and that we need more people of color in this field, then, you know, I think I've done my job.
No, I was already convinced before we started talking. I'd read the article, and I thought that this research is absolutely needed, and that I think it's a paradigm shifting point that you all have made about the importance of studying genetics and finding the best ways to implement it. And yeah, I think like you, my only concern is the institutional capacity that we have to make sure that it's implemented in ways that do the maximum benefit and do the least amount of harm, specifically to people of African descent. So I was already convinced before we started talking. And
Okay, that's good.
I mean,
Good to know.
I mean, I'm just me. I don't matter too much. I think the listeners, I think, will also be convinced. I think the logic to me is unassailable. It's just the concerns about institutions and power and our ability to protect the research of our brightest minds, like you and your co-authors. And it was a privilege to be able to speak to you. Like you mentioned, you all are half of the geneticists in the country. And I think that we absolutely need to have you come back and speak more. I'm sure that this is not the last. And I would love to bring you back and talk to you about any new issues that come up. I already understand the strength of this research, and I hope that more people do as well. This is absolutely necessary, I think.
Maybe I can bring back the all the co-authors.
Yeah, it would be great.
We can all talk again.
Do you want to mention where anyone can find more about you on perhaps social media? If you have any social media handles that you want to mention?
Yeah, I'm on Twitter. You know, I have a Twitter account. I have a LinkedIn account. I'm not huge on social media, but you know, follow me. I have more. You know, I post every once in a while. I don't have my handles. Let me have to look it up real quick. I think my Twitter handle is Akinyemi OO with that underscore. Akinyemi_OO is my Twitter. You can find my LinkedIn by just Googling my name, my full name.
Great. And that article, again, the article, if you all want to look at it, New England Journal of Medicine, arguably the most prestigious medical journal in the world. And the title of the article is Embracing Genetic Diversity to Improve Black Health. I will go out and say, I think that Dr. Oni-Orisan is a name that we are going to hear for a long time from now. This is just the beginning, and it's been a privilege to have you here. This is Afrometrics, research-based news podcast about the latest research about people of African descent across the African world. And much thanks, much appreciation to you for joining us today.